This country's strong, we're just devoted. That's why we're here.
Supporters of former President Donald Trump braving the elements for a chance to see him at tonight's rally.
Yeah, Trump arriving late this afternoon to downtown Green Bay, starting to speak just about an hour ago. It's the second half of a Midwest campaign swing today. He was in Michigan earlier today. He is still speaking at the Hyatt Regency this afternoon. As you can see right now, this is a live look. Began speaking just a little after 5 o'clock. The presumptive nominees last visited Wisconsin about 2 years ago. Here's what he said to supporters earlier today.
Look no further than the small town of Whitewater, Wisconsin. Does anybody know Whitewater? After being inundated with Biden migrants, this tiny town now has a budget shortfall of over $400,000. Their public schools are straining with hundreds of new migrant students who don't speak a word of English. Their police force is being diverted from traffic stops to migrant crime, our favorite new term, migrant crime. It's a new category of crime.
Meantime, state Democrats gathered today in response to Trump's visit, as well as encouraging people to vote blue. Local leaders talked about how President Joe Biden's policies and executive actions are having more than just a national effect, pointing out how his focus on infrastructure and growing the economy are having pivotal effects on community, businesses, and assets.
Joe and Tammy have prioritized Made in America policies, and now companies are investing billions of dollars right here in Wisconsin. And we're seeing it in Green Bay. Recently, Georgia Pacific has committed to expanding its Green Bay plant right here. Or if we look at the infrastructure package that is fixing our roads and our bridges, because of that infrastructure package, we're actually able to address a port right here in Green Bay, and we are making a new port terminal that's cleaning up an existing coal plant.
Those speakers today also noted it would be Trump's first visit to the state in 2 years, while President Biden has visited Wisconsin 3 times since the beginning of the year.
Speaking of the president, the White House announced this morning that President Biden will travel to Madison next week on Monday. President Biden is expected to discuss the administration's efforts at lowering costs for Americans. This will be Biden's 5th visit to Wisconsin since January of last year.